And welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. Delighted to say I'm here with Mike Lee. He's the Professor of Organisational Behaviour at INSEAD. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's great to be here.
And I know that you're normally in Paris, right? But you've headed back to the States right now, given our current situation.
Yeah. So my family, I'm from the US, so we moved to Paris last fall. We endured the longest train strike in about 50 years over the winter. And then, of course, this hit, and we decided with our 1-year-old daughter, felt like we wanted to be closer to family and have a little bit more space than our cramped Paris apartment. So we came back, and we're going to be here until, we don't know how long we're going to be here, but we are, monitoring the situation and looking forward to getting back to Paris at some point.
What do you miss most about Gay Paris? I must admit, I've only been there a few times, but
the bread, I would say. I know that's probably pretty cliche, but the bread in the U.S. is just, you realize how subpar it is relative to, and also just how difficult it is to get fresh bread in the U.S. versus in Paris. So we really miss our baguettes and our croissants.
Pain au chocolat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I'm sure you'll be getting back to them soon.
Yeah, and also cafe life, we miss as well, but we probably won't be getting that for a while, even when we get back. So that's too bad.
Yeah, they do cafes very well, don't they? There isn't. Yeah, there's no real comparison with a Starbucks, is there? End of your block and some of those Paris cafes. Yeah,
that's right.
Okay, good. So I came across you through previous guest Amy Edmondson, and then having researched you a little bit, I realize you've done some work with Amy around sort of relational dynamics and psychological safety, but you've also got this interest in Holacracy. We've also had Brian Robertson, the founder of Holacracy, on the show. So there's a couple of strands which I'm really excited about getting into in this interview, which I hope will be of interest to the audience. So should we start with the psychological safety and the work that you've done with Amy? And for those sort of just fresh to that topic, should we start with a definition for people?
Yeah, so psychological safety is essentially a concept that Amy, who was my dissertation advisor at Harvard, really kind of made famous and really expounded upon. Essentially, it's a feature of teams and the team culture and team climate where people feel psychologically safe, hence the term, to speak up, to take risks, to make mistakes without fearing, punishment or social sanctions or, other negative consequences to those actions. And what we know from a lot of research is that people are very reluctant to speak up. It's something that you would think, I think intuitively we would think is not that difficult in daily life, in family, and our friends. People don't have a problem speaking up. But you put them in organizations, you put them in a hierarchy, and all of a sudden, people are very sensitive to whether or not they are saying something that other people, particularly those higher up in the hierarchy, are going to dislike, especially if you're disagreeing with something. And so a huge body of research has shown the tendency and prevalence of people being silent, not speaking up with issues, and the kinds of consequences that has for organizations. So this isn't just a sort of trivial matter in organizations. This is something that can have huge consequences. Most notably, we know famous examples like the Challenger disaster, the Columbia disaster at NASA, that were a result of, in part, people's fear of speaking up and disagreeing and providing alternative viewpoints to those in higher management positions. And so Amy's research and a lot of other people have documented the importance and power of psychological safety, essentially the kind of antidote to this tendency to be silent in organizations. And what we know now is that psychological safety is one of the most powerful drivers of team learning and team performance. And so that hasn't only been shown in an academic setting, but also in sort of the field. So Google famously, I'm sure many of your listeners know about Google's Project Aristotle, where they essentially analyzed a bunch of their data and their teams and examined what were the factors that predicted which teams were most successful. And there were a variety of factors that they found, but psychological safety was by far the most important driver of team performance that they found. So it's
right. Is it not true as well that they were sort of searching around for what this factor might be, and it was when they came across Amy's work that they made the link and found that this could be the
that's right
magic factor, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Mm. And you wrote a dissertation, and Amy was your supervisor. What was it specifically that you looked at that sort of in this area?
So my dissertation was on a slightly adjacent area, but that I think is related to Amy's work on psychological safety. So I've always been interested in how do we address some of the problems with hierarchy. So we know hierarchy, is very, very powerful in enabling coordination and control in organizations, providing a sort of structure for progression. So there are lots of functions to this hierarchy, but we also know there are a large number of dysfunctions to hierarchy, whether that's what I just described, the tendency for people to not speak up and share information up the hierarchy. But also there are lots of problematic human power dynamics that arise in organizations. We know now from the last 20, 25 years of research in social psychology that power tends to basically cause what is similar to a type of brain damage, that it makes people mildly sociopathic, it makes people less empathetic, it makes people treat other people as means rather than ends. And so all of these, these power dynamics in hierarchies create, a lot of the relational disconnects and unhappiness that we see in many organizations. And so in my dissertation, was looking at organizations that were deliberately trying to eliminate the traditional hierarchy. And so in many ways, I was motivated by, I think, the similar observation that Amy makes in her research about the challenges of operating in a hierarchy, some of the dysfunctions, and how do we really address that. I happen to be looking at it from much more a macro structural perspective, like how do organizations operate without hierarchy, and what are the consequences, what are the dynamics of doing so. Whereas psychological safety is much more of kind of at the cultural level, in the kind of interpersonal dynamics of the teams and organizations. And I will say subsequently, I've done other research that wasn't in my dissertation that specifically looks at psychological safety and team dynamics and how teams can improve those dynamics. So I've done research on both topics.
Right. Well, maybe let's start with the hierarchy piece and then come back to the team dynamics. So sure. What did you discover in these organizations that had attempted to make a conscious attempt to limit the hierarchy?
Yeah. So one, it's very difficult. So I happen to be looking at a couple of organizations. One study I looked at was essentially I did an ethnography, which, going in depth for, more than a year, interviewing people, observing the work, observing meetings. And this was an organization that adopted Holacracy, which is one approach to creating a self-managing organization, or an organization that eliminates or gets rid of the traditional management hierarchy. And so what I found was, what was interesting, I think, about this organization and about Holacracy more broadly, is that it took a very different approach to kind of operating in a decentralized or flat way. So normally, and most of the examples that we have of organizations that get rid of bosses or get rid of traditional managers is that they tend to be fairly unstructured, that people's roles tend to be pretty ill-defined, they're very fluid and ambiguous. Decision-making tends to be made in the team in a consensus-based fashion. And so there's this archetype of the flat organization that is very organic and fairly unstructured. And what I found fascinating about this organization and about Holacracy is that it took a very different approach. It decided, no, we may be getting rid of vertical hierarchy or vertical structure, but we're going to substitute for that an increase in horizontal structure. So we're going to really clearly define roles. We're going to make those roles really visible, right? We're going to make those roles dynamic. So we're going to be constantly revising these roles. And so what I have found was that this, I think, new or different configuration of a flat organization, one that's very structured horizontally, but not so structured vertically, was that it enabled the organization to address some of the core issues or challenges with getting rid of hierarchy. Namely, how do you enforce accountability? How do you make sure people get their work done? How do you support coordination? And so people know what they're supposed to be doing, and how do you manage those interdependencies? But I think the most surprising thing I found was that actually the role structures helped support empowerment, which is one of the primary goals of these systems. And the way it did that is because they knew the boundaries of their roles really clearly, they were more, especially those who were more at the front lines, those who were lower down in the hierarchy, it made them more confident in exercising the power that the system gave them. Whereas before, and without that clarity, they would have been more conservative or maybe more hesitant to say, okay, I can make this decision now, because things were much more clear in the system, because they were made explicit and visible. Many people felt like that helped them actually exercise that power. And on the opposite side, so for senior people in the organization, these sort of clear role boundaries of authority helped provide a limit or a sort of help them be more mindful of when they might be overstepping the authority that they had in Holacracy, that they didn't have these limits that didn't exist in the prior hierarchical system. And so it was really interesting to see how kind of actually creating these structures, creating these boundaries actually supported decentralization of power, supported empowerment of frontline employees.
Right. And going back to your brain damage point earlier, did you have any evidence that those at the top of this hierarchy were less sociopathic, or?
That's interesting. So what I found was that senior people, there was a split. So some senior people really struggled with adapting to the new system. They struggled with the loss of control. In many ways, they became more controlling than they were before. So I had one example of a leader who was viewed generally as a pretty good manager, pretty good leader, empowered his people. But after the shift to the new system, he became more controlling, and people chafed much more under his leadership than before. So it actually was an interesting kind of contrast or revealing of maybe some underlying tendencies that were not as clear in the hierarchical structure. And then you had other senior kind of managers and leaders who really took to the system very naturally and actually felt like it opened and sort of empowered them, freed up their time to really focus on more strategic and long-term issues in their teams, in their organization. And so, and I think it was interesting because some of these leaders talked about how they never wanted to micromanage, but they almost felt like they had to in a hierarchical structure. And so they felt like this new system made it okay not to micromanage, which is a pretty interesting observation, that maybe what we're doing with hierarchy is we're sort of making that the default. We're making micromanagement, making controlling the default. And so one way to think about, I think, what these new systems like Holacracy are doing is they're changing the default. They're sort of changing the default towards let's empower, let's not micromanage. It doesn't mean that doesn't exist, right? There's still micromanagement, there's still controlling that happens even in organizations that have adopted these new systems, but it's less prevalent because there's a new default, because there's a set of processes and structures and rules to discourage that type of behavior.
Right, that makes sense. But also that, at least in the case of this one individual, you may get a blowback effect, and it actually increasing the level of those tendencies in some individuals. And it sounds like the structure itself wasn't able to deal with that, right? That behavior still existed in the system. It did get kind of self-managed out.
So what happened ultimately is that the team members became really frustrated because this individual, this leader, was acting in a way that contradicted every principle and rule of the system, and ultimately was reassigned to a different part of the organization, ended up leaving the organization. So whether or not that was all because whether or not it was all because of this transition to the system or not, it definitely was part of it was a factor in that evolution. And so it didn't stop the immediate behavior, but what it did was it eventually made that behavior untenable for the organization if they wanted to continue to operate in this way.
Right. And then you talk about this beyond the hype of Holacracy. What did you discover in terms of the limitations, I suppose, specifically of Holacracy, and then maybe more generally at sort of self-managing organizations?
Yeah, so I think I found a few limitations, right? So I found a few, like any system, every system, there is no panacea, right? So I think some people look to these new ways of working these new systems as the path to organizational nirvana. But I think every system has its own issues, its own trade-offs. And what I found with Holacracy, at least, is that the fact that they created all of these really well-defined roles and made these roles really visible, while it helped in many of the ways I just described, what it did is it created some problematic issues. One was that it made people so focused on their individual roles and their jobs that they became less attuned to collective issues like team concepts, the culture of the organization, the cultural values, which used to be a very prominent part of how of governing how people interacted and behaved, became less salient, because now everyone was focused on, okay, is this my job? Is this your job? Where are the boundaries between our roles, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing which was surprising, which I think is relevant for the title, your podcast is called Being Human, that in many ways the new system and the focus on these roles actually made relationships more depersonalized. And in some ways this was viewed as positive because people felt like they could make decisions and take actions without sort of being so concerned about other people's feelings, right? That like you had some clear objective basis for resolving conflicts in organizations. But on the other hand, it made people feel like, in some ways, like relationships were colder. So, people felt like it just was a cold system. And so I think that was a really interesting tension. And I think it's a broader tension in organizations, right? Like when is being human good for organizations, and when is being human really dysfunctional for organizations, right? Because like being human is not just it's good and bad, right? We're human beings are
right.
we do great things, and we're also really annoying and
Yeah.
problematic. And so I think that organizations deal with the same issue. How do you get the great aspects of humanity, but sort of minimize the problematic tendencies that we humans exhibit?
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying that, a couple of things come to mind. So I've done a couple of simulations of Holacracy, these workshops where you get to simulate one of these meetings. And I actually found it great fun, but there was something a little robotic about it. You know, you got these very set scripts and you're allowed to speak from a certain frame at a certain point in the meeting. And so it did felt, so I can imagine how people who are around that for a while start to feel a bit dehumanized it. And actually some people in the workshop were like, oh God, I couldn't do that. You know, they just the workshop experience of it, they had quite a visceral reaction.
Yeah, I think there is a huge divergence in like what people's natural inclination and tendencies towards, having process, having these rules, and whether that feels really good and empowering versus like really icky and sort of confining. So like my wife, for instance, she knows a lot about Holacracy from my research, and she just, has a visceral aversion to it. Whereas like for me, I think when I saw that, or when I sat in on my first meeting, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And so, I think it's some sort of personality, I think, characteristic that affects how people react to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the other thing that strikes me is I read an article from Tony Heisch, is it? I don't know sure how you pronounce it. Shea, sorry, Tony Shea from Zappos. And he was talking about how one of the things they'd had to do with their Holacracy implementation was kind of go back and reassert the Zappos culture, right?
Yes.
And reconnect to which actually chimes with exactly what you've just said, actually, that people sort of lose the wood for the trees, right? That they're so into the system of how they work, they forget the broader organization.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's sort of a finite amount of attention that people have in organizations. And so, are people paying attention to the culture? Are people paying attention to the meeting rules or the Holacracy constitution, their formal roles? Are people paying, so in the end, right, the organization had to find the right balance between where people were putting their attention. And they were finding so much of the attention was being paid to what's my role, what's my job, is it yours or mine, that the attention on these other factors was becoming too scarce. And I did want to say, because your initial question was, beyond the Holacracy hype, which was an article that I co-wrote with some colleagues in HBR a few years ago. And I think the argument we were making there is, look, like, this is not something that most organizations are going to do because it's so radical, because the change process is so difficult. That the point is not that this is, that we should think this is the future of work, at least in its sort of pure instantiation, but rather that this is something that more and more organizations are going to take pieces of. And so we should be understanding, and we should be studying these systems, not because we think this is what organizations are going to look like, but because it can point to specific either tools, principles, trends that are going to be sort of increasingly present in organizations. And so let's learn from these examples, right? They're kind of like the canary in the coal mine, the extreme cases that, we're not going to do that, but we can learn some things from this that even in a hierarchical structure, in a standard organizational structure, we can adopt.
Right. And yeah, it seems to me there's a sort of broader point here that if we've got a default which tends towards hierarchy and micromanagement, this is an example of an alternate default, and maybe we're going to discover others as we go forward.
That's right. So how do we architect, right, the organization in a way that it creates the defaults that we want. So I love, I love the research, from Cass Sunstein and other behavioral economists on choice architecture, right? So now we know that the way we become more and more aware of how the architecture of our choices and decisions affects what we do. So whether that's is the fruit at the front of the cafeteria line or at the end, is our 401k contribution made a default that we can change, or is it sort of defaulted to no contribution? All of this matters a great deal, just because we have a scarce amount of resources and time and attention to really think through these things. So we're more likely to go with the default. I think in organizations, it's very similar. So I sort of have become increasingly interested in this idea of how do organizations architect their processes and the interactions to foster the types of interactions that we know are good for teams, that we know are good for performance, that we know are good for team dynamics, performance. And unfortunately, most of the time we just leave. We don't think about these things. Leaders don't think about these things, and we just sort of assume that people will figure it out. We get the right people in the room, that organically that is going to either these good dynamics or these negative dynamics are going to emerge, and we just sort of hope for the best.
Yeah, right. Hire good people, right? I mean, yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And so I think so. What my research, and this is the kind of moving into my research on team dynamics. What I found there is the sort of power of structuring the interactions in a way so that you're really nudging people towards engaging with each other in the way that we know is good for team dynamics, such as like being open, sharing about who you are, not just kind of being professional colleagues, but getting to know each other as people and as human beings. Speaking up about work challenges, which we talked earlier, is a very difficult, a surprisingly difficult thing to do in organizations. And so there are ways that teams can create the types of structures, these interaction structures, to really facilitate these types of sharing behaviors, this openness and connectedness.
Yeah, no, that makes,
and psychological safety.
That makes a lot of sense. And management choice architecture. I mean, that sounds like a management consultant's wet dream, but I'm genuinely sort of interested by that idea, right? Like envisaging the organization of a sort of suite of choices that managers can make, and then being conscious about what those choices look like. That seems like a very powerful idea. And also, Chubbs, with the way that we know human cultures evolve, right? We evolve around ceremonies and formalized interaction and rules of engaging with each other. So it's a sort of, as I say this, it seems interesting to me that we've not really thought through that lens when it comes to organizations.
Yeah. No, I think the rituals it's like a great kind of metaphor for what these are, right? These are sort of, how do we create the rituals in our teams to facilitate the types of interactions we want. And in a way, it goes back to the conversation we're having about holacracy and people's aversion to the process and all the sort of rules around when to speak and all of that. Right. I mean, I think that we're averse to creating new rituals in teams, right? Because these formalized rituals, they feel uncomfortable at first. We prefer just informal, casual, unstructured interactions for the most part. And so in many ways, it's about getting over that initial discomfort and awkwardness of having these formalized, sort of structured interactions. And then I think getting more and more comfortable with that and sort of starting to see the power of what that enables rather than just what that constrains.
Yeah. And so you just started to touch on it, but then let's segue into your work around team dynamics then. So what else have you discovered in that field beyond what we touched on at the start in terms of psychological safety?
Yeah. So I mean, this is, we just touched on some of the kind of broad themes of that research. But more specifically, what we basically were studying a kind of team, a global team. So this is a team that had U.S. team members, India team members, and so most of interactions were virtual. So I think this is relevant for our current context where we're all operating in a virtual setting. And this is a team that was extremely dysfunctional. So people didn't know anything about each other. There was a huge amount of disrespect and blaming especially between kind of the U.S. team members and the India team members. And so we studied this team as it underwent this intervention. And it's in a way, it was action research because we were both designing the intervention and we were studying what happened. And so essentially, what we did is, one, we wanted to get people to get to know each other on a personal level. So we required that they, so every week they would have one person from India, one person from US call each other and just talk about, get to know each other. And what was interesting is when they were first asked to do this, the team members were really uncomfortable. They were like, well, can you give us any guidance on what we can or should be talking about? And so as facilitators, we gave them conversational prompts. So actually like topical prompts, like what does your family name mean something? Or how many siblings do you have? Right. I mean, all these things that as human beings, we would be very comfortable sort of knowing how to have these conversations. But in the workplace, especially this workplace and this team, felt extremely uncomfortable. But having the kind of specific conversation prompts, what we learned is that having these very specific question prompts really made it easier for people to have these conversations. And so that was one of that was one of the key insights is that in this, we essentially called these prompts that we were giving them scripts, interaction scripts. And so they're very specific on what content, what the content of these interactions should be, and also what the process is. So, they were supposed to, one junior, one senior team member from India, US, they were supposed to talk for, 30 minutes, and they should be talking about these types of topics. And so, and then the other part of the intervention was that as a team, they would meet weekly and they would each go around and answer the same 4 questions about their work, what challenges they were experiencing, and they were even given like response options. So 4 different levels of cartoon faces, from smiley to like crying faces. And so everyone went around each week and shared their response to these questions. And what we found is that this enabled kind of a greater level of openness, of vulnerability, of information sharing, of personal connection than existed in the team before, and that we know is difficult in most organizations. And so we sort of theorized about what this intervention really was. And so what we came up with is this notion of spaces. That this intervention was a combination of what we call spaces, which are essentially bounded settings where people can interact that is separate from like the normal everyday culture and normal everyday routines. And that creates sort of a zone for experimenting and risk-taking. And then the second piece of it were what we call these interaction scripts. And they're what specify the very, very clearly and explicitly, okay, here are the types of topics you can discuss, here are the response options, here's the ordering, right? Like, and so it's the combination of those that ultimately we felt like enabled this kind of collective risk-taking. And so I think the key insight here is that normally the types of behaviors, the open sharing, the vulnerability that we know is good for team dynamics is risky for any one individual to engage in. And the benefits, though, are all accrued to the team, right? So if someone does this, it's beneficial for the team, but the risks are all borne by the individual. So this is a classic collective action problem. And so what Spaces and Scripts do is it creates a platform for collective risk-taking. it makes it easier for any one person to take that risk because they know everyone else is going to take that risk as well. And so that's what we learned, is that, by creating these platforms, by creating these structured interactions, what we're doing is we're resolving or addressing the collective action problem that limits and that tends to prevent positive team dynamics from forming.
Right. And that actually chimes with my conversation with Amy. She didn't use that term, but I think she was alluding to the similar idea, because she talked about the asymmetry in psychological safety, right? That if I take a risk and I speak up, there's potentially a benefit in the long term for me having spoken up, but there's a much higher risk in the short term of me getting shut down and humiliated.
Exactly.
For me, right?
Exactly.
So I shut up. But if everybody's in this is making the same calculation in their mind, is that another example of a collective action problem? Am I right?
That's right. No, it's exactly the same collective action problem. And so unfortunately, though, when we hear about, okay, how do we foster psychological safety? How do we foster these team dynamics? Oftentimes we focus on, okay, what individuals can do. So what can they do? So like, leaders need to be more humble. They need to ask questions. They need to write, or individuals need to have the courage to speak up. So, there's sort of this, some talk of like, how do people be more courageous in organizations to take these risks? Right.
But then the answer to that might be, well, let's have a value called be brave, and let's put it on posters in the list and just assume people are going to start being brave. And
I'm sure that's already happened. I'm sure that there are organizations that have done that. And, there's nothing wrong with courage. I think courage is great in organizations. And certainly even in all organizations, there are truth tellers. There are people who speak up even when there are risks or in the face of risks. But to expect that to be the norm, right, is just unrealistic. And so we need to think about this more systemically. We need to think about why people are not speaking up at a systemic level, at a cultural level, and how do we change the risk calculation so that people, normal people, the average person, feels comfortable to speak up, to share their viewpoints, to be vulnerable, et cetera, et cetera. That, I think, is what we need to be thinking about more.
Right. And you found a great way to do that with these scripts when it came to people getting to know each other at a deeper level and the benefits that then accrue to the team.
That's right. So how can we create a sort of architecture? How do we architect this sort of interaction space to make this the default, right? To make this less risky and to make everyone feel like that they can be taking these risks together.
Yeah. That's great. And anything else that came out of that study?
Let me see. Those were kind of the key findings. But I think, in many ways, what I think is interesting is that this happened very quickly, right? So these changes happened very quickly in the team. So over the course of like 10 weeks, the team dynamics went from being extremely dysfunctional to people, I wouldn't say it was like nirvana, but, substantial improvement in the team, more connection, more communication, more helping, so that people started helping each other. If they were free, had less work or lower bandwidth or more bandwidth, they would, offer to help. People would ask each other for more assistance. And so there was better collaboration and coordination. So this had real impacts on the way the team did their work, right? It wasn't just about, do we feel connected to each other? And so I think, especially in this virtual context, I'm sort of thinking about, okay, how does this apply now to the current reality? We're all having these Zoom meetings in teams, and I think, everyone is stressed, has less bandwidth, there's more crises. And so I think it's easy to not think about how do we maintain or cultivate these relationships, these dynamics in our team. And I think the truth is, or one of the insights is that it doesn't take a lot of time, right? To have a check-in at the beginning of a meeting where people share something that's not work related, whether that's like, how are they feeling? What's something that, gave them joy recently? What's their spirit animal, if you want to get really kind of creative and out there. But these little kind of rituals, right? These little rituals have a really powerful effect on kind of bringing the team together and fostering these types of connections, trust, psychological safety that we know makes sort of the work flow much more easily and productively.
Right. Well, then I must ask you, Mike, what is your spirit animal?
I think it changes.
What is it today?
God, it's a tough. Okay, let me think. I don't know. I think maybe my default is a monkey. And that's probably because I'm a monkey in the Chinese zodiac. So I'm Chinese. And so I grew up always being told I'm a monkey. So I'm also like thin and long, my limbs, so I think my body is sort of a little monkey-like, although I can't climb trees very well. So I'll go with that.
Right. Mike the monkey.
What's yours?
I think it was dolphin. So dolphin was almost my favorite animal. And right now, I haven't seen the ocean or been. Every time I get a chance, we could just about get to kind of quite a big river near us. I love to get out to the river. So yeah, my it's also my star sign Pisces. So yeah, that's
mine as well. Mine is as well. So
right,
2 Pisces.
As a random tangent, is that something that's sort of honored in the Chinese culture as well? The zodiac,
the zodiac specifically, or do you mean like the astrological signs?
I suppose the zodiac specifically.
I mean, yes, it is. It's unclear. I feel like it's not taken too seriously, but people do talk about it. Like my family, we just had my daughter, and she's I think the year of the pig, and so it's mentioned. I think they're kind of there are always these compatibility rules around, okay, which signs are less compatible or more compatible. But it doesn't feel as precise as astrology does. Not that astrology is, I'm not an astrologist, but it's like it's the entire year, right?
This could be the end of your academic career.
Exactly.
The precision of astrology.
I have to tread carefully here. Right. So, you're a monkey if you were born in one entire year, right? So obviously it's hard to put much stock into that. So anyway.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's a good diversion. Well, there you go. This is, I think, is a good example, right? We probably learned a little bit more about each other in that interaction.
That's right.
Where I, in that case, took the risk. But you gave me the prompt. I asked you about your spirit. That opened something up in this conversation that I don't think would have happened without that little script and you giving me the permission to ask it, right?
That's right. And I expressed my vulnerability around my view of the precision of astrology as well. So there you go. Yeah.
No, that's good. And so okay. So we've talked Holacracy. We've talked about some of your research on team dynamics. What's lighting you up right now, academically?
It's a good question. Well, I just finished teaching, so I'm sort of coming down and trying to recover from that Zoom process, which actually turned out to be quite nice in the end, and my students were fabulous. So yeah, I think right now I'm really starting to think, in addition to continuing to sort of work on publishing some of my current research, my dissertation. I'm thinking about, okay, what sort of new studies, do I want to really look at? So, I think potentially doing some, field experiments where we take this idea of scripts. So one of the things that happened in these scripts is there are these personal scripts and there are these work-related scripts. So the personal scripts are like, how do we get to know each other as people? The work scripts are really like, what are the challenges that we're experiencing in our work? And, we found in our study that, both of them were really important and they sort of they mutually reinforced each other. But it would be interesting to see, okay, like, do we need both? Like, what if a team just used personal scripts or work-related scripts? Like, what sort of impacts does that have? Do you need both? I think questions around facilitation. So, one of the things that I'm really interested in and find fascinating is that, most management meetings are run by the manager. And so we know from lots of research that when the manager is running the meetings, people are not going to speak up as much, or at least that's, I don't know if anyone has actually, in a way, that's what I'm interested in, is I don't know if anyone's actually studied, okay, what happens when we run meetings, when teams run meetings and the manager is no longer running the meeting. So, lots like Holacracy. In Holacracy, the meetings are not run by the sort of team lead. There still is a team lead role, but that person does not facilitate the meetings. There's a separate role of facilitator that's elected, and that person is responsible for kind of holding the process of the meeting.
And what I also discovered with Holacracy is that after a while, actually, even the individual facilitator role somewhat diminishes, right? Because people become so familiar with the process, it's almost becomes self-facilitating.
That's right. So people sort of self-facilitate, and then they also usually suggest that teams rotate the facilitator to kind of create, there could be power that gets kind of accrued to that role over time. And so part of it is also like, let's make sure that we continue to rotate people in and out of this role. And so what if, like, even in a traditional hierarchical structure, what if teams elected a facilitator or had a facilitator who wasn't the manager to actually run the meeting? What impact would that have on kind of how much information is shared, how people feel about the meeting, et cetera, et cetera. So, one idea that I think I would love to do is run an experiment where we essentially have some teams that, continue to operate with manager as the meeting facilitator, and others that, elect someone else and develop some kind of like agreement. Okay, here's how we're going to run the meeting. So, I mean, even small like changes like this, I think have the potential to have a pretty large impact on psychological safety, on empowerment, on team performance, coordination, information sharing. And so, looking at how we can design interventions to explore what are the levers, what are these levers that we can change, is interesting to me. And then also, I think more broadly, in this, one of the things I'm sort of about to send out a survey that is exploring everyone is talking about, okay, the new normal, how is this going to change the way we work? It's obviously changed the way we work temporarily. But I feel like we still don't really understand at a kind of more nuanced level, like what has really happened with the way people work beyond, yes, we're doing it virtually. Yes, we have our kids at home and don't have any childcare, right? So we're all like crazed, but how is this actually changing the dynamics that sort of within teams? And so whether that's, how empowered are you? How micromanaged are you? What's the sort of the nature and dynamics of the communication within the teams now? How are decisions, like how quickly are decisions being made? Lots of these different aspects, conflicts, experimentation, risk-taking. And so I'm, planning to collect some data and send out a survey to really collect, okay, what are the stories that people have around, okay, what are the ways in which work has changed for the better as a result of this? And what are the ways in which your team or your work and the way your team works, how has it changed for the worse? And so I really think that this, like any crisis, this has the potential to kind of create a divergence where it may lead some teams to really kind of change their dynamics and change the way they work in a really productive and positive way, and other teams in a really negative way. And so I think understanding that at a deeper level is something that I'm currently, working on, collecting some data around and developing some insight around what's actually going on.
Great. Oh, yeah. Well, I'd love to get you back on the show at some point, later down the line. If you develop some findings there, that'd be fascinating to see what you learn.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anecdotally, I'm hearing a lot of positive things actually right now. Engagement going up.
What are some engagement?
Like people, I've spoken to a couple of CEOs on a call yesterday actually, and they were finding that they were getting much more access to the teams because they could just jump on a call really easily, right? And drop into a meeting in a way that they couldn't have done before. And that was having an increase in engagement of staff. So that was a positive. Another story in terms of getting close to customers, much easier just to invite a customer and say, hey, can you come and join our team huddle? We'd love to get your thoughts. Much easier than trying to set up the logistics of a physical meeting.
Oh, interesting.
So those was, and then, but also the drain. Yeah, and then I saw some great research about why Zoom calls drain us, especially group calls, because we're simultaneously trying to
process
the body language of like 10 people at once, right, in a way that we wouldn't in a physical situation. So people finding they're getting drained, to some, by the sort of Zoom marathons.
Yeah.
So now the couple of some of the things I'm picking up.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. But I'm fairly hopeful actually that this is going to be overall a positive change. People will end up on net with more freedom in their lives and less.
You mean even after we say go back to the office?
Yeah, I think because I think so many managers will have kind of gone through a forced sort of curve to trust the technology, and will, I suspect, allow people more freedom. Now, whether there's a sort of a correction back, and we're also seeing spike in sales of sort of employee spyware, right? Software that can monitor your keystrokes per second or whatever. So it's not like it's necessarily all going to be positive, but my expectation is that this is going to be a net positive for the workplace.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I don't know if I have I feel like I'm fairly ambivalent at this stage. Because I think people tend to react in very different ways to these crises. And I don't know. I feel like maybe I'm a little bit more skeptical than you about that. I'm hopeful that you're right. But I certainly think virtual work is going to be more acceptable and normatively kind of okay in organizations as a result, whether that's like people working from home more often, and that's going to obviously be the reality for quite a bit of time. But whether that actually changes the kind of level of empowerment or control or autonomy that managers give to people, I'm much more skeptical about. Because in the end, the dynamics of like why managers do that, if they can, right, if they're physically able to monitor, and which once you go back to the office, you would be, they're still there, right? The defaults are still there. The accountability that managers are facing, the sort of, all of that is still there. And right now, maybe the answer is like managers just can't monitor right now. They're just physically incapable of doing that. But once they're able to, again, like it's unclear to me why they wouldn't. So maybe that's where some of my skepticism comes from. But I guess we'll have to see. And it's ultimately a good question for research.
Yeah, and good that you're staying skeptical. Good. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike. In terms of people finding you in your research, where's the best place to point them?
They could either go to my website, which is just michaellee.co. They could search me, my name in INSEAD, so Michael Lee INSEAD, and also on Twitter, my handle, which is my Chinese name, so it's probably not worth trying to say here, but it's also on my personal website, and maybe we can put it with the episode.
We'll put it exactly. We'll put all the links in the episode as well. But for people listening, okay. Well, thank you once again. Enjoy the rest of your day in the States. It's been fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I had a great time.
Thank you.